From Texas. Go ahead.
What I'll do is talk about why paradigm. But I'll start.
Somebody turn off the camera already.
Well, I don't want to. It's tempting to go back to the beginning, but the beginning is pretty far back. But just, it is useful to think a little bit about some elements of American history which bear quite directly on American current policy in the Middle East. The United States is a pretty unusual country in many ways. One of them is that it's maybe the only country in the world that was founded as an empire. It was an infant empire, as George Washington called it. And the founding fathers had pretty broad aspirations. The Rotarian of them, Thomas Jefferson, thought that this infant empire should spread and become what he called the nest from which the entire continent will be colonized. That will get rid of the Reds, the Indians, they'll be driven away or exterminated. The blacks, they'll finally be sent back to Africa, and we don't need them anymore. And the Latins will be eliminated by a superior race, a very racist country through its history, not just anti-black. So that was Jefferson's image, and the others more or less agreed with it. It was, in addition, so it is a settler colonialist society. And settler colonialism is far and away the worst kind of imperialism, I think the most savage kind, because it requires eliminating the indigenous population, not just controlling them, exploiting them. And that's not unrelated, I think, to the kind of reflexive U.S. support for Israel, which is also a settler colonialist society, and its policies that kind of resonate with a sense of American history. It's kind of reliving it. And it goes beyond that because the early settlers in the United States, I'm sure you know, were religious fundamentalists who regarded themselves as the children of Israel and following the divine commandment to settle the promised land and slaughter the Amalekites and so on and so forth. That's right around here, the early settlers in Massachusetts. Of course, all of this was done with the utmost benevolence. So, for example, the Massachusetts, where Mayflower and all that business, Massachusetts was given its charter by the King of England in 1629, and the charter commissioned the settlers to save the native population from their misery of paganism. And in fact, if you look at the Great Seal of the Bay Colony of Massachusetts, which you can find on the internet, worth looking at, it should be on the walls of every classroom in the country. It depicts an Indian with his holding two spears pointed down, sign of peace, and out of his mouth is coming a scroll on which is written, "Come over and help us." So that's one of the first examples of what's called humanitarian intervention today. They were, and it's about typical of other cases up to the present. The Indians were pleading with the colonists to come over and help them, and the colonists were benevolently following the divine command in their plea to come over here and help them. Well, it turned out that they were helping them by exterminating them, and that was considered rather puzzling around the 1820s when the Supreme Court Justice wrote about it. He said it's kind of strange that despite all of our benevolence and love for the Indians, they are withering and dispersing like the leaves of autumn. How can this be? And he said, well, the divine will of providence is beyond human comprehension. It's just God's will, and we can't hope to understand it. And this conception, it's called providentialism, that we're always following God's will, that goes right to the present moment. Whatever we're doing, following God's will. It's an extremely religious country, kind of off the spectrum in religious belief. very large percentage of the population, I don't remember the numbers offhand, but it's quite high, that believes in the literal word of the Bible. And part of that means supporting everything that Israel does, because God promised the promised land to Israel, so of course we have to support them. These same people, it's a substantial core of solid support for anything that Israel does. They also happen to be the most extreme anti-Semites in the world. They make Hitler look pretty mild. They're looking forward to the total annihilation of the Jews. A small number are permitted to survive for some reason, but most of them are to be annihilated after Armageddon. A long story about this, which is believed literally in high places by people like Reagan, George W. Bush, probably others. And that ties in with the kind of settler colonial history to provide a solid base. Christian Zionism, it's called, which long precedes Jewish Zionism and is much stronger, is a kind of a solid base for reflexive support of what Israel happens to be doing. The conquest of the national territory was, I don't have to tell you, a pretty ugly affair. It was recognized by some more honest figures like John Quincy Adams, who was the great grand strategist of expansionism, the theorist of manifest destiny, and so on. In his later years, long after his own horrifying crimes were in the past, he did lament what he called the fate of that hapless race of Native Americans who we have exterminated with such malicious and savage and cruelty. And he said that's one of the sins that the Lord is going to punish us for in the end of days. Still waiting for that. His doctrines are highly praised, right to the present. So there's one major scholarly book on what's called The Roots of the Bush Doctrine, Bush #2, by John Lewis Gaddis, one of the leading American historians at Yale University. And he correctly, plausibly describes the Bush Doctrine as a descendant directly of John Quincy Adams's manifest destiny doctrine. He says this is a conception that runs right through American history. He praises it. It's the right conception. It's the conception that, of course, we have to protect our security, and expansion is the path to security. And you can't really have security until you control everything. So we have to expand not just over the hemisphere, but over the world. That's the Bush Doctrine. So it's all the right thing to do. It goes back to the origins of the most highly praised figures. Without going into the details, by the Second World War, though the U.S. had long been by far the richest country in the world, it was still playing a kind of a secondary role in world affairs. The main actor in world affairs was the British, and the French had a more global reach. Second World War changed all that. American planners during the Second World War, Roosevelt's planners, understood very well from the beginning of the war that the war was going to end with the U.S. in a position of overwhelming power. And as the war went on, and the Russians ground down the Germans, pretty much won the European war, it was understood that the U.S. would be even more dominant. And they laid plans, careful plans during the war for what the post-war world would look like. The U.S. would have total control over a region that would include the Western Hemisphere, the Far East, the former British Empire, and as much of Eurasia as possible, including, crucially, its commercial and industrial core of Western Europe. That's the minimum. The maximum is the whole world, and of course we need that for our security. Within this region, the U.S. would have total control, unquestioned control, and would limit any effort at sovereignty by others who try to interfere with it. It's quite an expansive doctrine, and it was based on a certain sense of reality. The U.S. ended the war in a position of dominance and security that had no remote counterpart in history. Had half the world's wealth, it controlled the whole hemisphere, the oceans, the opposite sides of both oceans. It was just, it wasn't total. The Russians were there. Some things were out, still not under control, but it was remarkably expansive. Right at the center of it was the Middle East. One top Roosevelt planner, a really long-time high-level planner through Roosevelt Liberal, for many years a leading figure in top planning, he pointed out that control of Middle East oil will yield substantial control of the world. Well, that doctrine remains. It's a doctrine that's operative right at this moment, and it will continue. One very fine Middle East scholar, Gilbert Ashkar, points out sort of ironically in a recent book that Saudi Arabia will be a leading ally of the United States as long as there still is one drop of oil left in the desert. After that, they can go the way of the Native Americans. And they probably will. And that remains a leading theme of policy. Now, for a long time during the Cold War years, the policies were invariably justified by the threat of the Russians. It was mostly an invented threat. The Russians ran their own smaller empire with a similar pretext, threat of the Americans. These clouds were lifted after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For those who want to understand American foreign policy, an obvious place to look is what happened when the Soviet Union disappeared. That's the natural place to look, and it follows almost automatically that nobody looks at it. It's not discussed in the scholarly literature, but it's obviously where you look to find out what the Cold War was about. And in fact, if you look, you get very clear answers. The president at that time was George Bush #1, and immediately after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, there was a new national security strategy, a defense budget, and so on, and they make very interesting reading. The basic message is nothing is going to change except pretexts. So we still need, they said, a huge military force, not to defend ourselves against the Russian hordes, because they're gone, but because of what they call the technological sophistication of third world powers. If you're a well-trained, educated person who came from Harvard and so on, you're not supposed to laugh when you hear that. Nobody laughed. In fact, nobody even reported it, I don't think. But there is, we got to have this to protect ourselves from the technological sophistication of third world powers. We have to maintain what they call the defense industrial base. The defense industrial base is a euphemism for high-tech industry, which mostly comes out of the state sector, computers, the internet, and so on and so forth, under the pretext of defense. And we have to maintain that. With regard to the Middle East, they said we must maintain the intervention forces, most of them aimed at the Middle East. And then comes an interesting phrase. We have to maintain the intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, where the serious threats to our interests could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. So, in other words, sorry, folks, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now the pretext is gone, so we have to tell you the truth. The problem in the Middle East is and has been what's called radical nationalism. Radical just means independent. It's a term that means independent. They'll follow orders. The radical nationalism can be of any kind. Iran's a good case. So in 1953, the Iranian threat was secular nationalism. After 1978, it's religious nationalism. But it remains a threat. 1953 was taken care of by overthrowing the parliamentary regime and installing a dictator. It was highly praised. It wasn't a secret. It was highly praised. The New York Times, for example, had an editorial praising it as the overthrow of the government as an object lesson to countries that go, to small countries that go berserk with radical nationalism and seek to control their own resources. This will be an object lesson to them. Don't try any of that nonsense. Certainly not in an area that we need for control of the world. That was 1953. Since the overthrow of the U.S. imposed tyrant in 1979, Iran has been constantly under U.S. attack. I mean, without stop. Right away, first Carter tried to reverse the overthrow of the Shah immediately by trying to instigate a military coup. That didn't work. The Israeli wasn't called, in effect, the ambassador. There had been a very close relation between Israel and Iran under the Shah, though theoretically no formal relations, and the top official, in effect, the ambassador, Uri Librani, advised that if we could find a military officers who were willing to shoot down 10,000 people in the streets, that we could restore the Shah. That was Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's foreign policy national security advisor, had pretty much the same advice. Well, that didn't quite work. Right away, the U.S. Turned to support for Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Iran, which was no small affair. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Iranians were slaughtered. The people who are now running the country are veterans of that war. And they, deep in their consciousness, is the understanding that the whole world was against them. The Russians, the Americans, all supporting Saddam Hussein in the effort to overthrow the new Islamic State that was established. And it was no small thing. I mean, the U.S. support for Saddam Hussein was so extreme that, of course, Saddam Hussein's crimes were just denied, like the Al-Anfal massacres and the massacres of the Kurds. The Reagan administration just denied them, blamed them on Iran. Iraq was even given a very rare privilege. It's the only country other than Israel which has been granted the privilege of attacking a U.S. naval vessel and killing dozens of soldiers and getting away with it with complete impunity. In the Israeli case, it was the Liberty in 1967. In Iraq's case, it was the USS Stark in 1987, a naval vessel which was part of the U.S. fleet protecting Iraqi shipment from Iran during the war. And they attacked it with French missiles, Exocet missiles, which killed a couple of dozen soldiers, the sailors, and got a slight tap on the wrist, but nothing beyond that. U.S. support was so strong that after the war was over, the U.S. basically won the war for Iraq. It continued. 1989, it's now George Bush #1. He invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons development. It's one of those little things that kind of gets hushed up. A couple months later, Saddam became a bad boy. He disobeyed orders. And then right after that came harsh sanctions and so on, right up till today. Well, coming up till today, in the foreign policy literature, in general commentary, what you read commonly is that the major foreign policy problem for the United States is how to deal with the threat of Iran. It remains a threat, just as it's been ever since it became independent. Well, what exactly is the threat of Iran? Actually, we have an authoritative answer to that. Came out a couple of months ago in a publication of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, technically independent institute that's very closely linked to the government. They come out every year with an analysis of the global military situation called Military Balance. The latest one was April. It's called Military Balance 210. And of course, there's a section on Iran, the major threat. And they go into it, and it's important reading. You can probably pick it up on the internet, I'm sure. What they say is, whatever the Iranian threat is, it's not a military threat. They say that Iranian military spending is quite low, even by regional standards. And as compared with the United States, of course, it's invisible, less than 2% of U.S. military spending. Furthermore, they go into Iranian military doctrine, and they say Iranian military doctrine is geared toward defense of the national territory. They remember the Iraqi invasion backed by the West and by Russia, which is no small thing. Their military doctrine is designed to slow down an invasion sufficiently so that it will be possible for diplomacy to begin to operate. That's their military doctrine. They say it's possible that Iran is thinking about nuclear weapons and go beyond that. But they say if they're developing nuclear weapons, it would be as part of the deterrence strategy. That is an effort to prevent an attack, which is not unlikely. It's not a remote contingency. I mean, the most massive military power in history, namely us, which has been extremely hostile to them, is occupying 2 countries on their borders. It's openly threatening them with attack constantly, so is its Israeli client. So it's not a small thing. So they say, well, they may be thinking about nuclear weapons for deterrence. That's the military side of the Iranian threat. Nevertheless, they go on, they're a major threat. The threat is, the primary threat is that they're attempting to expand their influence in neighboring countries. Now that's called destabilization. They're carrying out destabilization in neighboring countries by trying to expand their influence. And that's a problem for the United States, because the United States is trying to bring about stability. When the U.S. invades another country, that's to bring about stability. Stability is a technical term in the international relations literature. It means obedience to U.S. orders. So when we invade Iraq and Afghanistan, that's to create stability. If the Iranians try to extend their influence in these 2 neighboring countries, that's destabilizing. And this is kind of like built into scholarly and other doctrine. It's even possible to say without ridicule that, as was done, for example, by the liberal commentator who was former editor of Foreign Affairs, James Chase, who once pointed out that the U.S. had to destabilize Chile under Allende to bring about stability. And that's not a contradiction. Had to undermine the government, destabilize it in order to bring about stability, namely obedience to U.S. orders. Perfectly straightforward, non-contradictory. So the main threat of Iran is its destabilization of neighboring countries by trying to extend its influence. And the secondary threat of Iran is its support for terrorism. Now, what's terrorism? Well, that's 2 examples of support for terrorism. One is its support for Hezbollah in Lebanon. The other is its support for Hamas in Palestine. Well, whatever you think about Hezbollah and Hamas, maybe you think of the worst thing in the world. What exactly is their terrorism? Well, the terrorism of Hezbollah is actually celebrated in Lebanon every year on May 25th. I happened to give a talk in Beirut that day, just this last May 25th. That's Lebanon's national holiday. One national holiday. Schools are closed, banks are closed, and so on. And it's celebrating the expulsion of Israeli invaders from Lebanese territory in the year 2000. Hezbollah resistance, guerrilla warfare, did finally force Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon, which it had been occupying for 22 years in violation of Security Council orders, with plenty of terror and violence and torture and so on. So they finally left, and that's Lebanese Liberation Day. So that's the main core of Hezbollah's terrorism. And that's the way it's described. Actually, in Israel, it's even described as aggression. You can read Israeli press these days, high-level figures arguing it was a mistake to withdraw from southern Lebanon because that permits Iran to renew its aggression against the United States, against Israel. It was carrying out aggression up until 2000 by supporting resistance to the Israeli occupation. That's aggression against Israel. They follow our principles. We say the same thing. That's Hezbollah. I mean, there are other acts you can criticize or whatever, but that's the core of Hezbollah terrorism. But what about Hamas? Well, Hamas became a serious threat, a serious terrorist organization in January 2006, when Palestinians committed a really serious crime. It was the date of the first free election in any country in the Arab world, and they voted the wrong way. That's completely unacceptable. And immediately, without the blink of an eye, the United States and Israel turned very publicly towards punishing the Palestinians for that crime. You can read in the New York Times, parallel columns right afterwards. One of them talking about our love for democracy and so on, going right back to the Great Seal of the Bay Colony of Massachusetts. And right alongside it, the plans to punish Palestinians for the way they voted in the January election, which were no joke. I mean, there have been plenty of punishment of Palestinians before, including Gaza, but it escalated sharply after January 2006. Actually, Israel went so far as even to cut off the flow of water to the arid Gaza Strip. But within a couple of months, by June, Israel had fired about 7,700 rockets at Gaza, plus all sorts of other attacks. All of that's defense against terrorism. It escalated later, escalated sharply, and Hamas carried out became a really major terrorist force in June 2007, when the U.S. and Israel, with cooperation of the Palestinian Authority, tried to carry out a military coup to overthrow the elected government, and it was beaten back. And Hamas took control. Well, okay, after that, they became one of the world's leading terrorist forces. And there's plenty of criticisms to make of it, the way they treat their own population, for example. But Hamas terrorism is a little hard to establish. The current claim is that the terrorism consists of rockets, the Qassam rockets from Gaza that hit Israel, border cities. And that's the justification that was given for the Operation Cast Lead, the U.S.-Israeli invasion of December 2008, and also for the capture of the attack on the recent flotilla a couple weeks ago, where 9 people were murdered. The reason is to stop the rockets. It's only in a deeply indoctrinated country that people can hear that and not laugh and ridicule. Putting aside the comparison between Qassam rockets and the terror that the U.S. and Israel are constantly carrying out, the argument has absolutely no credibility for a very simple reason, that Israel knows exactly how, and the United States knows exactly how to stop the rockets. Exactly. By peaceful means. There was a ceasefire in June 2008. Israel agreed to a ceasefire with Hamas. Israel didn't really live up to it. They were supposed to open the borders, and they didn't. But Hamas did live up to it. You can take a look at the official Israeli government website, or listen to their official spokesman, Mark Rega, and they agreed that during the ceasefire there wasn't a single Hamas rocket. The ceasefire was broken by Israel in November 2008 when it invaded Gaza and killed a dozen Hamas activists. And then there was some rocket fire and far greater attacks from Israel. And some number of people were killed, Palestinians as usual. And Hamas then offered to renew the ceasefire. Israel considered it, cabinet considered it and rejected it, preferring to use violence. And a couple of days later came the U.S.-Israeli attack on Gaza. Now, in the West, in the United States, and in fact in the West generally, it's taken for granted, even by the human rights groups and Goldstone report and so on, that Israel had the right to use force in self-defense. And then there's the criticism that it was disproportionate. But they had absolutely no right to use force in the first place. You have no justification for the use of force unless you've exhausted peaceful means. And in this case, the U.S. and Israel had not just not exhausted them, they'd refused even to try peaceful means, which they had every reason to believe would succeed. Accordingly, I continue to call it U.S.-Israeli invasion, because that's what it was. What Israel does is in tandem with the United States. That invasion was just a criminal act of aggression in the first place, and the human rights reports are basically irrelevant. They're talking about details. And the concession that Israel had a right to attack is just an amazing gift. If Israel was acting rationally, when the Goldstone report came out, instead of turning it into a major international affair, Israel should have welcomed the Goldstone report, thanked them for having accepted the Israeli position, that, as they did, that Israel had the right to attack, and then published a 2,000-page document which no one would ever look at, going through the specific claims and saying, well, you didn't notice that there was a Hamas guy hiding in the doorway, and so on and so forth. Those are impossible claims to prove. Instead, they turned it into like a major act of anti-Semitism, comparable to the Holocaust. And it's pure irrationality. What's more striking is that here and in Europe, it's accepted as legitimate. Israel has the right to use force, even though it knows perfectly well that there are peaceful means that could achieve the claimed ends. We just saw the same farce reenacted with the flotilla. Israel claims that they couldn't let the flotilla come in because they are carrying cement, and Hamas might use the cement to build bunkers for rockets, but that has no credibility. It's ridiculous in the first place, but it has no credibility, if only because they can stop the rockets easily, just by accepting the truth, which they want to do, because they want to pursue the policies that much more far-reaching policies. Well, that's the Iranian threat. What about the Israel-Palestine issue? It's commonly argued now. Take a look at tomorrow's papers. You'll see that Abbas, Palestinian Prime Minister, made a speech in Washington in which he said, well, the hope for a two-state solution is fading. Maybe we ought to give it up. And it's pretty common now for supporters of the Palestinians and Palestinian leaders themselves to say, well, we have to abandon hope in a two-state solution. We should, as one of the Palestinian leaders said, we should give Israel the key, let them take over the whole West Bank. There'll be one state. We'll then carry out a civil rights struggle. It'll be like an anti-apartheid struggle, and we can win that one like South Africa. That's a very common view among supporters of the Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership. It overlooks a simple point of logic. But those are not the two options. There's a third option, namely that the U.S. and Israel continue doing exactly what they're doing. They're not going to take control of the West Bank. They don't want it. They don't want the Palestinians. The analogy to South Africa, to an anti-apartheid struggle, is pretty misleading. South Africa needed its black population. They were its workforce. They couldn't get rid of them. 85% of the population did the work of the country. So kind of as under slavery, they had to take care of them. You've got to take care of your workforce. So Bantustans were bad enough, but they were intended to be more or less viable because it was necessary to reproduce the workforce. But that's not true for Israel and the Palestinians. Israel has no interest in Palestinians at all, doesn't want to take any responsibility for it, wants them to get out. It's like the United States and the indigenous population here. No intention of taking care of them, just exterminate that hapless race of Native Americans. But they can't just murder them, because you can't get away with that these days, the way the United States did in the 19th century. So just let them leave. It's no big secret. Moshe Dayan, who was the more dovish members of the Israeli elite, and happened to be defense minister and in charge of the occupied territories in 1967, he advised at the time that to his colleagues that we should tell the Palestinians that we have nothing for you. You're going to live like dogs, and whoever will leave, and we'll See where that ends up. And that's exactly the policy they're following. Get them to live like dogs, and whoever leaves will leave. Now, in recent years, Israel has somewhat, the U.S. and Israel again, when I say Israel, I mean U.S. Israel, have somewhat modified the policy. They're taking the advice of Israeli industrialists who some years ago suggested that Israel should shift from a policy of colonialism to a policy of neo-colonialism. Neo-colonialism is, for example, the Philippines is a standard model. That's where many of the modern programs of neo-colonialism were carefully crafted. Actually, a very good study, it's a detailed study which is worth looking at by Hal McCoy, a fine historian, came out about a year ago on how the U.S. subdued the Philippines after the conquest. We know what happened during the conquest. The U.S. conquered the Philippines, as usual, with most benevolent intention, uplift and Christianized them, and so on and so forth. Slaughtered a couple 100,000 people, carried out massive war crimes, and so on. But then what happened? Well, what happened after that, and McCoy goes into it in 800 pages of detail, is that they crafted a new technique of control of the population using the most advanced high-tech technology of the day. They imposed a system of close surveillance over the entire population, co-opting an elite, a westernized elite who would live in luxury, breaking up nationalist groups by various methods, sowing rumors, buying people off, and so on. And of course the paramilitary force, that's the muscle in case things go wrong, the Palestine-Philippine constabulary. That turned out to be very effective. In fact, it's still in place in the Philippines. Again, if you look at today's paper, you will notice that the U.S. Welcomes the new Philippine government. And if you read the articles, front-page articles, you'll see that they do point out that much of the population lives in misery. In fact, if you think about it, that's the one part of East and Southeast Asia that hasn't taken part in the East Asian economic growth, spectacular growth of the last generation, not the Philippines. It's also the one U.S. colony, former colony, now neo-colony. And it's still run the same way it was 100 years ago, virtually same field, the same elements, the same constabulary, different names, and so on, with the U.S. just in the background, not very far. But that was an extremely successful mode of colonization. It became the model for Haiti, the Dominican Republic, many other neo-colonies later. And it also turned back to the imperial countries. Both the United States and Britain adopted similar measures of population control domestically, at first during the First World War, even more so till today. So Britain is maybe one of the leading surveillance societies in the world. The United States is not that far behind. And they're using modified versions of what was crafted with great care and success in the Philippines a century ago. Well, Israel finally understood that that's the right way to proceed. So, in fact, if you read, you can read about, say, Ramallah in the West Bank, and the reports which are accurate say that it's kind of like Paris and London for the Palestinian elite. They live a nice life, theaters, restaurants, it's fine. A typical third world country with a rich collaborationist elite in a sea of misery and suffering around it. That's the way the third world is structured. And Israel has finally had a sense to follow the advice of industrialists and turn Palestine into a neo-colony. And it can be praised for how wonderful life is in Ramallah and so on. But you have to have control it by force. There has to be the analog of the Philippine constabulary, and it's there. It's an army run by an American general, Keith Dayton. It's It's called Palestinian, but it's actually, it's constituted of Palestinians. So it's quite typically in neo-colonial structures, the repressive force is domestic, foreign run. It's run by an American general. It's trained by Jordan, which is a harsh dictatorship, a police state, pretty much, and Israel. Israel and Jordan train the forces. The United States runs them, and they're very successful. In fact, they're highly praised by American liberals. And so John Kerry, who's Obama's the senator from Massachusetts, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he's basically Obama's point man in the Middle East. You've seen him all over the place. He gave a talk at the Brookings Institution, a sort of liberal think tank, in which he explained that for the first time, Israel now has a legitimate negotiating partner, so it can pursue its passionate hope for peace for the first time. The legitimate negotiating partner is the Palestinian Authority, and the reason they became legitimate, Kerry explains, is because they now have a military force which can control the population, namely the Dayton Army. And he points to their success. The main success story was during the U.S.-Israeli invasion of Gaza, when they anticipated that there might be protests in the West Bank over the atrocities being carried out there, but there weren't any, because the Dayton Army was able to suppress them. So it kept things quiet, and it kept things so quiet, General Dayton said in a speech to one of the offshoots of the Israeli lobby, that they were so quiet that Israel could in fact dispatch forces to take part in the Gaza attack, thanks to the American-run army, which was controlling the West Bank. They didn't have to worry about any protests there. So that's a real success, very much like the success in the Philippines a century ago, the successes under the U.S.-imposed National Guards in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and other neo-colonies. And now Palestine can look forward to that same auspicious fate, and we can praise ourselves for having created an army which can control the population so effectively that they can't even protest the major slaughter going on in the other part of Palestine. Well, I say the other part of Palestine, but U.S.-Israeli policy since Oslo, since 1991, one crucial component of it has been to separate Gaza and the West Bank, treat them totally separately, break them up. That's one of the ways to prevent the recognition of any authentic Palestinian nationalism. I mean, if Gaza is part of the West Bank, as of course it is under international law, that means that a Palestinian state would actually have access to the outside world, would have a seaport, for example, and that's dangerous. You want them to be completely controlled, by the Jordanian dictatorship on one side and by U.S.-backed Israel on the other side, whatever comes out there. So you got to separate them from Gaza, and that's been done pretty effectively. The Israeli analyst who's written most extensively and fully about this is Amir Haas, a very fine journalist who writes for Haaretz. And yes, that's major policy. But now that's succeeding in particular, by pursuing the Philippine model, with the Dayton Army as the core of the analog in Philippine constabulary. And, pretty good life for the A-League's been Ramallah. Well, that's the third alternative, going back to the options for the Palestinians. One of them is a two-state settlement. The other is not what is being proposed. A one-state settlement and an anti-apartheid struggle. There's the slightest indication that anything like that will ever happen. There's no support for it anywhere, and the U.S. and Israel would never accept it. But the third option, the real one, is continuation of exactly what's being done. Now, what's being done is not a secret. Actually, Prime Minister Asa Olmer outlined it to a joint session of Congress a couple of years ago to rallying applause. It's what he called convergence. It's now been expanded. But convergence means Israel takes over everything that's of any value, takes over everything between what is this, what's called the separation wall. It's actually an annexation wall which is completely illegal. There's no question about that. Go through the details if you want, but nobody doubts that it's illegal. Israel take over everything. In fact, Israel accepts that. Everything inside the separation wall, the annexation wall, which happens to include the sources of water in the region. The main source of water lie under that, the West Bank aquifer. And it also includes the pleasant suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. So Israel takes that. It takes over the Jordan Valley, it's a third of the country of Palestine. The 22% that's left for Palestine, Israel will take over that. That imprisons the rest. It's more narrow land. Palestinians are now pretty much kept out of it. And in the remaining territory, Israel has established several corridors which just cut through it. So the main one is what's called Jerusalem is actually way bigger than Jerusalem. It was illegally annexed by Israel. It's, I think it's 5 times the size of Jerusalem. Israel takes over all of that. And to the east is a corridor extending through the town of Al-Dunim, which was established in the 1970s, but mainly built with Clinton's support under the Oslo agreements. And the purpose of that corridor is to bisect the West Bank. It reaches almost to Jericho, which would be left to the Palestinians, and the rest is just desert. And then to the north, there are a couple of other corridors which cut through the rest. So what you end up with is what the architect of the policy, Ariel Sharon, called Bantustans, separated cantons, all separated from Gaza. And Sharon's description was quite unfair because they're worse than Bantustans, for the reason I mentioned. South Africa had to sustain the Bantustans. Israel has no interest in sustaining these cantons. For them, it can follow the Dayan proposals. We have nothing to offer you. You can live like dogs. Leave if you can. And many are leaving, especially the more wealthy Christian populations. But some would be left in the neo-colonies for New York Times reporters to write travelogues about how wonderful this has been done recently. That leaves nothing for the Palestinians when they don't. Can they call it a state? Yeah, they can if they like. In fact, the first Israeli prime minister to accept the notion of a Palestinian state was in fact Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister. That he took office for the first time in 1996, replacing Shimon Peres, who's regarded here as the great dog. Peres left office in 1996, informing the press that there will never be a Palestinian state. Right after that, Netanyahu came in. He's condemned as a super hawk. And his Minister of Information was asked at a press conference. He said, look, you're going to leave fragments here and there of the Palestinians. What do you do if they decide to call them state? He answered, well, yeah, they can call them state if they like, or they can call them fried chicken. We don't care. Either will do. So that's the first Israeli recognition of the possibility of Palestinian self-determination. A couple years later, the Labour Party said pretty much the same thing. And yeah, that is the action. The realistic option, if nothing is done, is to pursue present policies and end up by leaving what's left to the Palestinians as fried chicken. That's the option, not one state, not an anti-apartheid struggle, not a civil rights struggle. That's all pipe dreams, pie in the sky. Well, is there any other alternative? What about the first option, two-state settlement? There are a lot of problems in the world where it's hard to think of a solution, even to conjure one up. But in this case, it's remarkably easy to conjure one up. It's there. And furthermore, there's overwhelming international support for it, supported by international law. It has one barrier. The U.S. won't accept it. That's it. It's been sitting there since 1976, not moved. In 1976, the major Arab states introduced a Security Council resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the international border with guarantees it used all the wording of UN 242. Those of you who know the history know that that's the kind of document that everybody agrees is the major document. It used all that wording, guarantees for the security of every state in the region, including Israel, of course, with secure and recognized borders and all nice words. That was the proposal in 1976. Israel refused to attend the session. The United States vetoed the resolution. Again in 1980, the same resolution. And we'll go through the history of the same record since in the General Assembly and the Security Council. Who supports it? Everybody. It's supported by the Arab League, by Europe, by the non-aligned countries, by the Organization of Islamic Unity, which includes Iran. It's supported by Hamas. Hezbollah's position is it will support anything the Palestinians except the Lebanese organization. So there's exactly one barrier. The U.S. and Israel refused to accept it. And they refused to accept it on grounds that were established in 1971, 5 years before this. In 1971, I think that's probably the most fateful decision in Israel's history. Egypt, under President Sadat, offered Israel a full peace treaty. Egypt is, of course, the only significant military force in the Arab world. So a peace treaty with Egypt means full security. There was a quid pro quo. Israel should withdraw from Egyptian territory. It didn't want to do that because Israel was then expanding into the Sinai, trying to build a big city with a million people in the northern Sinai and Mediterranean settlements and so on. And they had to make a choice. Are we going to accept expansion? We have to choose between expansion and security. And they decided on expansion. That was amplified the following year when Jordan made the same offer about the West Bank. At that point, Israel could have had full security, but it chose expansion, mostly into Sinai at the time, but also into the West Bank at the beginning already. But they recognized that it's completely illegal. It was their leading legal authorities right in 1967, including a very well-known, respected international lawyer, Taylor Meron, informed the government, and the Attorney General seconded him, that any transfer of population into the occupied territories is in violation of international law. And Moshe Dayan, as I said, was defense minister and in charge of the territories, agreed. He said, yes, we know that it's in violation of international law, but states violate international law, so we'll do it too. And we can do that as long as the U.S. supports us. And that's what's been going on. Well, the rejection of Sadat's offer led to the 1973 war, which was a very close thing for Israel. They were almost destroyed. At that point, the U.S. and Israel recognized that you can't just disregard Egypt as a basket case and then starts various, Kissinger's famous shuttle diplomacy, leading to the Camp David agreements, in which the United States and Israel basically accepted Sadat's 1971 offer. They had no choice. But from that point on, 1971, the U.S. and Israel have preferred expansion to security, and that continues to the present. Israel could have security now, just to get rid of the rockets, have no hostile countries on its borders, but it would have to abandon expansion into the West Bank and the savage criminal siege of Gaza. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. I said that the United States has led the rejectionists pretty solidly since 1976, but there is one exception, and it's a revealing one. In Clinton's last month in office, January 2001, he recognized that the offers that had been made to the Palestinians by the United States and Israel at the Camp David failed negotiations, could not possibly be accepted by any Palestinian, no matter how right-wing. and he produced what he called his parameters, which were sort of vague but more forthcoming. And he then made a speech in which he pointed out that both sides had accepted his parameters, both sides had reservations, that they met in Egypt, Egypt in January 2001 to iron out the reservations. And we have detailed information about those negotiations. Most of it comes from high-level Israeli sources, a lot of it's in Hebrew, but there's plenty in English if you want to find it out. No debate about it. They came very close to a settlement. In fact, in their final press conference, the two sides jointly announced that if they had a couple more days, they probably could have settled everything, all the details. Well, Israel called off the negotiations prematurely. In the end of that, a lot has happened in 2001, but that single event is pretty instructive. It indicates that if a U.S. president was willing to tolerate a political settlement, it could probably be reached. Will that happen? Well, so far there isn't the slightest indication of it. Obama's more, at least as extreme as George W. Bush, maybe more so. But there are some fissures developing, and they're interesting and worth watching. One thing is that the American population, including the American Jewish population, especially younger Jews, are just not willing to support what's going on any longer. It's too inconsistent with standard liberal values. You see it in polls and other indications, so kind of withdrawing from it. I mean, the Christian Zionists are a huge group. They support it no matter what. Those who have the memory of U.S. settler colonialism, for them it's sort of normal, surely support it. But elite sectors are beginning to back off, and the American Jewish community is beginning to back off. That's one development. Another one is that for the first time, there's a split in the Pentagon and intelligence. Up until now, they've been strongly supportive of Israel. They regard it as a very valuable ally. The U.S. in high-tech industry has been highly supportive of Israel. The Wall Street Journal is, among major newspapers, is the one that's most pro-Israel, in favor of Israeli expansion. But all of this is beginning to weaken, and there's striking indications of it. You've probably seen a comment by David Petraeus, sometimes called Lord Petraeus in the United States, a great genius who's now the head of the Central Command. He made some comments a couple of months ago about how the U.S. now has forces, armies in the field in several countries of the region, Afghanistan, Iraq, this all happened next to Iran. And it's just dangerous for those forces in the field if Israeli intransigence, meaning U.S.-Israeli intransigence, creates problems among the population and endangers our forces. He was told to shut up, so he quickly withdrew his statements. But others have been repeating. One of the highest officials in U.S. Middle East intelligence, Bruce Riedel, was the man who ran Obama's Afghanistan campaign. He repeated pretty much the same statements. Others have done so too. It got to the point where Martin Indyk, who was Clinton's ambassador to Israel, the guy who has his roots come right out of the Israeli lobby, and he actually had an op-ed in the New York Times warning Israel that they shouldn't take the U.S. for granted. The U.S. policy could shift. Israel's, the head of the Mossad in Israel, Mayor Dagan, in Israel, warned the government that they're treading on thin ice. If they push too far, they might lose U.S. support, which of course would be lethal for them. That's developing, and there's a history which is worth paying some attention to. I'll finish with that briefly. There are a lot of comparisons drawn between Israel and South Africa, but most of them I don't think amount to much, like the apartheid-Pakistan comparison. I don't think it works for the reasons I mentioned. But there is one comparison which isn't discussed, which I think is worth attention. Back in around 1960, the white nationalists of South Africa we're beginning to recognize that they're becoming a pariah state. They're losing global support. They're being voted down in the United Nations by a big majority of the former colonies and so on, even losing some European support. And the foreign minister of South Africa called in the U.S. ambassador to discuss it with him. And he said, yes, we're becoming a pariah state. They're voting against us in the United Nations. But you and I both know that there's only one vote in the United Nations, yours. And as long as you support us, we'll stand up against the world. And that's exactly what happened. If you look in the following years, anti-apartheid sentiment did increase by around 1980. Even American corporations were pulling out of South Africa in opposition to apartheid. A couple of years later, Congress passed sanctions against South Africa. The Reagan administration had to evade congressional sanctions as well as popular and global opinion in order to continue supporting South Africa, as indeed it did, right through the 1980s. The pretext was the War on Terror. In 1988, the Reagan administration declared that this is the Pentagon under Colin Powell, incidentally, declared that the African National Congress, Mandela's ANC, was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. So we had to keep supporting the white South Africa, the famous War on Terror, which Reagan declared, not Bush. It was going on in the 1980s. In fact, as you may know, just 1 year ago, Mandela was taken off the terrorist list. He can now enter the United States without special dispensation. But that continued right through the 80s, and South Africa looked completely impregnable. It had crushed the ANC on the ground, and the world hated it, but there was no real opposition to it. It looked like it was in a permanent position of victory. Then U.S. policy shifted. Around 1990, the U.S. shifted its policy. Mandela was let out of Robben's Island, began to be groomed to take over. Within a couple of years, apartheid was gone. The South African foreign minister was exactly correct. As long as the Godfather supports us, doesn't matter what the world thinks. But of course, the Godfather can change his mind. And that happened. And you go to the post-apartheid era, beautiful, big victory. And it's not the only time. I'll just take one other example, which is quite striking. None of these things are ever discussed. They can't be discussed because what follows from them is that the U.S. rules the world and rules it by force. And you can't accept that, though it's true. Another example, which is quite instructive, is Indonesia. In 1975, Indonesia invaded the former Portuguese territory of East Timor with strong U.S. support, later British support and French support, and it carried out some of the worst crimes of the late 20th century, virtual genocide, and wiped out maybe a quarter of the population. This went on right through 1999, right through all the posturing about Serbia and Kosovo and so on. Strong U.S. support, British support, French support, and so on. Crucially, U.S. support. That continued right until September 1999. At that point, you can find the date, it was September 11th, 1999, Clinton, the Indonesian military was saying, we're never going to leave, we don't care what the world thinks. It's our territory, we're going to keep it with U.S. support. On September 11th, 1999, Clinton uttered a quiet phrase. He informed the Indonesian military that the game's over, and they immediately withdrew. He could have done that. The U.S. could have done that 25 years earlier. Incidentally, that now goes into history as a humanitarian intervention. But why did Clinton shift position? Well, for one thing, there was a lot of international opposition at the time. There was a domestic support solidarity movement, which had some effect. But probably the major effect was right-wing Catholics, far-right Catholics who represent a strong sector of power in the United States, leading figures in the Reagan administration. East Timor was a Catholic colony, and they turned against it. And under those pressures, Clinton changed his mind. A day later, the Indonesian military left. No more control. Well, could happen in Israel. The Mossad director, Mayor Dolan, could be correct. It could be that the U.S. will shift its policy with enough pressure and insist on joining the world, on accepting the international consensus on a two-state settlement, and Israel will have no choice. It will have to follow those orders, just as Indonesia did, just as white South Africa did. That's the way power systems work. Could that happen? We don't know, but we do have the capacity to influence that consequence, maybe bring it about. It's a kind of an optimistic conclusion in a way. Well, there's a lot more to say about Iran. You could go into it if you like. It's quite instructive to the present, but I want to stop there and take a look.
Egypt's role in keeping the siege of Gaza?
I'll speak loudly.
Can you please speak about Egypt's role in keeping the siege of Gaza?
Egypt's role?
And the steel wall being built?
Yeah. Well, Egypt has been, I actually just had an interview that appeared in Al-Ahram, the main Egyptian newspaper, almost appeared. What they published eliminated one sentence, namely talking about Egypt's complicity in the savage attack on Gaza. Not to my surprise, that sentence was eliminated in our Egyptian ally, the great democracy. But yeah, Egypt, you're quite right, has been complicit. Egypt is more frightened by Hamas than Israel is, for quite a good reason. Egypt's a dictatorship, a brutal, harsh dictatorship, strongly supported by President Obama, who has said straight out he's not going to criticize them because they're nice dictators. Mubarak is a nice guy, and he helps us. He maintains stability, so I won't say anything about it. One of the reasons why nobody in the Middle East with a brain functioning can take Obama seriously when he talks about human rights. But they're very worried, because if they ever allowed anything remotely like a democratic election, there is a popular force in Egypt which would come out pretty strong, could turn into a majority, namely the Muslim Brotherhood. And so they don't want to allow anything remotely like a democratic election, and the United States supports them in that, because we don't want the U.S. doesn't want the Muslim Brotherhood to play a role either. Well, the Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, so Egypt doesn't want any. They were horrified by the popular victory in Palestine. So yes, they're complicit in maintaining the siege. Egypt also understands U.S.-Israeli policy, which is not very obscure. The U.S. and Israel want to throw Gaza into the hands of Egypt. Gaza has been virtually destroyed. Israel doesn't want it, the United States doesn't want it. So they can't just kill everybody, because you can't get away with that these days. You could in the 19th century, but you can't now. So they have to keep the population barely alive. As you may have read yesterday, in response to international criticism about the flotilla, they relaxed the restrictions a little bit, so now they can get potato chips and shaving cream and a couple of other things. But the idea is to keep them just barely alive, and to abandon any responsibility for them, and to toss them into the hands of Egypt. But Egypt doesn't want them. So for that reason, and because of the fact that they're ruled by an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt's been participating in the siege. They are building, as you said, a wall, apparently with U.S. Engineering support, to seal off the country totally, and partly just to increase savagery of the siege, but also partly to confound the U.S.-Israeli policy, which is attempting to toss Gaza into the hands of Egypt, which they don't want. So yes, Egyptian complicity has been very strong. The Egyptian dictatorship is a close ally of the United States and Israel, and has good reasons not to want to go along with the U.S.-Israeli policy of caging the animals and maybe letting them go into Egypt. And there's a good reason why the Egyptian press would not permit that sentence to appear.
Since January 2009, I've been interested in Israel's motivations for the Gaza attack. Norman Finkelson has written that it was to restore its deterrence capacity. And I guess I have a question framed around that. I'm wondering if you agree with that thesis, and if you see his position, which is that Israel at some point must suffer a military defeat, possibly at the hands of Hezbollah or Iran, and what the dilemma is for activists who are interested in seeing some sort of lessening of power, but have a dilemma about supporting groups such as Hezbollah who are resisting and defending themselves, and what our role should be if such a repeat of summer 2006 might occur.
I think he has a plausible case. Israel was defeated in 2006, and they recognize it. And they want to maintain a kind of posture of invincibility, and it was seriously harmed in 2006. Maybe they thought that by smashing up Gaza they could restore it, but I don't know exactly who they thought they were impressing. I mean, to show that an advanced modern army can destroy a totally defenseless population, which can't even fire a pistol in response, is not a very impressive demonstration of deterrence capacity. And so if that's what they thought, which maybe they did, it's not a very impressive demonstration. I suspect that probably they know that they can stop the rocket attacks, but to stop the rocket attacks would mean accepting an agreement with Hamas and providing some legitimacy for the elected government. And they don't want to provide any legitimacy for the elected government. They want to separate Gaza. It was the elected government of Palestine, not just Gaza. They've got most of the cabinet in prison, in fact. They want to destroy it. It's an independent force, can't be tolerated. It's a nationalist force, and they want to make sure they destroy it. And one way to destroy it is to create the Gaza prison and crush the population. And that does lead to rocket attacks, which they could end, but only by granting them legitimacy. That may be a sufficient reason why they wanted to carry out the attack. And it's kind of like South Africa. And they understand that as long as the U.S. backs them, they can do it anyway. Even in the face of, as I mentioned, even the human rights groups in the Goldstein report accepted the Israeli position. And I can't find a word in the Western commentary which questions it. Europe is so subordinate to the U.S. that the European educated opinion just mimics whatever people say here. They think they're independent. It's not a joke. If the U.S. says Israel had the right to use force, okay, they had the right to use force. They didn't, in fact, not in a pretext, but 100% support virtually. So sure, they get away with it very much like the South African case, very much like the Indonesians, up till September 1999. The thin ice may crack, but good reason to think that they can get away with it. It's probably enough of a reason. What about a military defeat? Well, I told you, I think I was in Lebanon a couple of weeks ago, and among other things there, I did talk to some of the leading Western Middle East correspondents, some were based in Lebanon, and some have been there for decades, really know the region very well. And the most significant, the most knowledgeable of them expect a war, and in fact think that both Israel and Hezbollah want a war. Hezbollah wants a war so that it can really show that it can destroy Lebanon. It won't be beaten as it was last time. And also, if Israel decides to, with U.S. backing, to attack Iran, as might happen, they have to destroy Lebanon first, because Lebanon has a deterrent capacity now with Hezbollah. So they may attack. And they think that Hezbollah wouldn't mind that, because they take seriously Hezbollah's claim that they have the capacity to carry out a massive assault against Israel, which would be very destructive. So it could be that there'll be a war and the two of them will destroy each other. It's not impossible. It could happen soon. States don't necessarily act rationally. And Israel in particular is becoming extremely irrational. Paranoid, ultra-nationalist. Take the attack on the flotilla. It's a completely irrational act. And if they wanted to, they could have easily disabled the boats, shoot away their rudders and tow them ashore. They didn't have to attack them. Attacking a Turkish-flagged ship and killing Turks is about the craziest thing they can do from a strategic point of view. I mean, Turkey is their one regional ally. It's been a very close ally since 1958. So antagonizing your one regional ally for absolutely no reason, it's kind of like insanity. And they've done it before. A couple of months earlier, they purposely humiliated the Turkish ambassador in a manner which I don't even think has a precedent in diplomatic history. Well, that's pretty irrational. Their reaction to the Goldstone report was also extremely irrational. They had a much easier way to do it. I mean, even a very minor case, like preventing me from lecturing at a Palestinian university, was a completely irrational act. I mean, if they'd let me come in and talk at the Palestinian University, nobody would have heard of it. And by blocking it, okay, they turned it into an international incident, condemned in the press all over the world. I mean, they're acting in a way which is paranoid, hysterical, irrational, almost full support of the population. Mood is spreading in Israel of the world hates us because the world is anti-Semitic, and what do we care? We're going to stand up against the world. The more they're hated, the more they're denounced, the more it proves that the whole world is anti-Semitic and we're right, nobody understands us. If you follow the Israeli press, you see this very directly. In fact, in today's the English edition, there's a couple articles, and that's the one light of sanity left in the country. There's a couple of articles by correspondents pointing out how we're destroying ourselves by taking this bunker mentality. It's called, we're just heading to disaster. And it's very much like white South Africa in that respect. Their position was, okay, we can withstand the whole world as long as the Mafia Don is backing us up. When it came to the Mafia Don changed its position. They may face the consequences. They claim there's an existential threat from Iran, but I ran through the U.S. strategic analysis of the threat. The threat is that Iran doesn't obey Western orders. It's not an existential threat to Israel, except that it is a deterrent to their efforts of regional dominance. And they may, if they talk themselves into thinking this is an existential threat, they may go all out. But I don't think they'd do it without U.S. support. And the outcome of that, you can't even think of. I mean, it's not that Iran is that irrational. There's a possible conflict brewing in the region, which is really frightening to think about. Iran, as you may know, has announced that it intends to send ships to break the Gaza blockade. If that happens, all bets are off. Israel could go berserk. They're a powerful state. They have hundreds of nuclear weapons. They could decide to destroy the region and destroy themselves. Who knows? It's scary. Israel has a doctrine which goes back to the 1950s. They sometimes call it the Samson complex. It's named after the most respected and honored suicide bomber in the world in history, Samson, the first suicide bomber. Those of you who have a good education know that Samson, famous hero, killed a lot of Philistines and so on, and was Delilah cut his hair off, and he lost his strength, and the Philistines captured him and blinded him, but his hair grew back and his strength came back, and he was in the temple, standing between two columns, and all the Philistines were in the temple, thousands of them, and he pulled down the temple walls and killed himself, and killed more Philistines in his death than in his lifetime. That's great hero, Samson, first suicide bomber. Well, the Samson complex goes back to the 50s. If the world presses us too far, we will go crazy. We'll go crazy, and we'll bring down the temple walls. Of course, we'll get killed too. Who cares? It's part of the psyche, national psyche. It's expanding march, and it's not a joke. It's could happen.
You talk about the Netanyahu administration's attempt to crush left dissidents in the country.
It's not just Netanyahu. It's blamed on Netanyahu constantly, but it is the national mood. You take a look at polls. The national mood is shifting very far to the ultranationalist right. It's paranoid, it's hysterical, it's irrational, and part of it is that we got to crush any dissent. We have to crush any attempt to question the legitimacy and magnificence of what we're doing. This change in the country in the last few years is dramatic and very frightening. They're really kind of circling the wagons, kind of reminiscent of white South Africa. And that's, Netanyahu he's riding on that wave, but he's not creating.
Yeah, pretty much after every act of Israeli aggression and pretty much any human disaster, on the news you hear them throw out the term international communities calling for independent investigation. I'm just wondering who these investigators are, if they have any legitimacy at all. I was just wondering if when the international community asks for an independent investigation, who are these investigators and do they have any legitimacy at all?
Most of what's going on doesn't get reported.
Yeah.
But just a couple of days ago, there was an important meeting of the real, what we call the international community, means the United States and anybody who happens to agree with it. That's the international community. Like maybe the whole world disagrees, but then they're against the international community. I'm not joking. So take the idea that the international community is calling on Iran to stop enriching uranium. Okay, yeah, you read that everywhere. Exactly who is the international community? Well, it's not the non-aligned countries, which are most of the world. They vigorously support Iran's right to enrich uranium as signers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they're not part of the international community. A couple of years ago, I don't know what it's like now, but a couple of years ago, a majority of Americans agreed with them. So the majority of Americans weren't part of the international community. The international community is Washington and whoever happens to be one along with it. Okay? It was pretty striking what happened in the last couple of weeks about this. As you know, I'm sure, Turkey and Brazil made a deal with Iran, which would have was pretty similar to what the U.S. had proposed. They would arrange for uranium to be enriched outside of Iran and then return it to them for medical purposes. Well, the U.S. went berserk. Actually, it turns out that Obama had written a letter to Lula, the president of Brazil, advocating that, probably because he believed that Iran would never agree, and then he'd be able to refer to the letter and say, well, we tried, but they wouldn't do it. But Iran did agree, much to their discomfiture. So the U.S. instantly reacted by ramming through a UN Security Council resolution, which is so weak that China agreed to it instantly, and Russia agreed to it. If you read the terms of the resolution, which is now passed, it's praised here as a great resolution, but if you look at the small print, it does actually almost nothing. About its only effect is to transfer to China even greater control over the resources of Iran by putting some constraints on the West and developing Iran's resources. So they're quite happy with it. Russia's happy with it because it permits them to sell all the arms they want to Iran and so on and so forth. But the U.S. had to ram it through to make the world know who's boss, not Brazil and Turkey. And Turkey is the most important regional power, with a long border with Iran, so they're not allowed to be boss. Brazil is the most important country and the most respected country in the South, so they can't be boss. In fact, if you read the New York Times, the headline saying, spot on Lula's legacy or something, it's destroyed his legacy by standing up against the United States. Today there was a report by, quote, some high-level U.S. official saying, we gotta do something to make sure that Turkey stays in line, not showing its oats and thinking they can do something independent of the U.S. Well, that's kind of like the mafia. You got to make sure that nobody interferes with your right to control everything. So we'll ram through an almost meaningless UN resolution to block the Turkish-Brazilian initiative, which could have made some progress. I lost track of your question by now. What was the question? Repeat it. Sorry.
Who are these independent investigators?
Oh, the independent investigation. Well, there is the relevant part of the international community is actually there is an Asian security system. It's called CICA. I forget what it stands for, but you can look them up on the net. They had a meeting. It includes most of the Asian states, China, India, all the states in the region, includes Iran, includes Israel. They had a security meeting a couple of days ago, and the meeting decided to call for an international investigation. Well, the rules of the organization require consensus. Okay, and of course Israel didn't agree, so the vote was like 22 to 1 or something. Therefore, there was a separate declaration released, which you can find on the internet, got published, calling for an international investigation. Well, nothing happens unless the boss agrees. The UN, Obama immediately blocked the Security Council, prevented a Security Council resolution calling for an investigation. The Asian Security Organization was just blocked out of the media like a non-aligned country. So like it didn't happen, except it did happen. So there's almost unanimous call for an independent investigation, but like everything else, if the U.S. doesn't agree, it doesn't happen. And so we're back to the usual position. The boss decides. I mean, international relations theory doesn't amount to much, in my opinion. I know some of you are studying it. I don't want to insult your field, but frankly, I don't think it amounts to much. There are some principles of international relations, and probably one of the most important principles is that international affairs works like the mafia. Very similar to the mafia. I mean, the Godfather does not accept disobedience. It's too dangerous. A small storekeeper somewhere doesn't pay protection money, can't let him get away with it. Maybe you don't need the money, but if he gets away with it, somebody else will get the idea. Presume the system control erodes. So you don't just send in your goons to get the money from them, because you don't need it anyway. You send them to beat them to a pulp, so everyone gets the idea. That's how international affairs works. Sometimes it's called domino theory or some other thing. But you look at case after case, it constantly works like that. Well, in this case, the U.S. has got to be boss. The principle that controlling Middle East oil gives us substantial control of the world is still true. And nobody else is allowed to horn in. Not Turkey, the most important regional country, not Brazil, the most important country in the South. In fact, if you look at the Security Council vote, the three countries who have anything to do with the Middle East either voted against or abstained. Turkey, Lebanon abstained, can't stand up against the United States. Brazil, of course, voted against. That's the most important voices. Turkey, I think, has a 300-mile border with Iran. There aren't going to be trade constraints unless they agree. but it doesn't matter. We got to show that it was. So there won't be an international investigation because we say so.
Does it mean anything that Turkey's in NATO? Does it mean anything that Turkey is in NATO and they attacked a Turkish ship, Israel attacked a Turkish ship in international waters?
Well, there is a NATO treaty. There's a little debate about technically how the ship was flagged. So don't worry about that. But if it was a Turkish flagged ship, as claimed, then there is a NATO treaty, that means it's Turkish territory. Under maritime law, a ship in international waters is part of the territory of the country that flags it. There is a NATO treaty which requires the NATO powers to go to the assistance of any NATO country under attack. So, yes, NATO should have, if treaties meant anything, which of course they don't, the NATO countries led by the United States should have immediately gone to support of the Turkish ship. I mean, if an Iranian ship had attacked a NATO vessel, probably Iran would be blown off the face of the earth.
You just mentioned about this boss who says what can happen and what can't. Sorry, about basically you're saying about the boss in the world, and then he decides, or the United States decides what can happen and what can't. And so it's basically the model of nation states. And then sometimes other times you just speak about economic classes and saying that if you looking at nation states actually isn't being in the real world, you have to look at economic classes instead. How does that work?
That's an interesting question, and Iran is a very striking case, but I'm going to talk about it, so I'm glad you brought it up. There are a couple of principles of international affairs, all of them missing from international relations theory. One principle is the mafia principle. That's a dominant principle of international affairs. Another one is a principle that traces back to Adam Smith. We're supposed to worship Adam Smith, but we're not supposed to read him. That's too dangerous. He's nowhere near the crazed lunatic that is constructed in ideology. He's a pretty sensible guy. So he pointed out, he was talking about England, of course. That's what he cared about. He said that in England, the principal, I'm quoting him, the principal architects of policy are the merchants and manufacturers, people who basically own the economy. So they're the principal architects of government policy, and they make sure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, served very well, no matter how grievous the effect on the people of England, and let alone the others who are subject to what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans. He was talking about British atrocities in India. But the merchants, the guys who own the country, they make the policy. That's Adam Smith. That's another principle of international affairs. Well, sometimes the principles of international affairs conflict. And those are interesting cases for the study of policy formation. And actually, Iran is an interesting case. In Iran today, the guys who own the country, the major economic forces, they would be pretty happy to have the United States normalize relations with Iran. For example, the U.S. energy corporations are not delighted that China is picking up all the goodies in Iran. But state policy requires that we give the resources of Iran to China, and over the objection of U.S. energy corporations, which usually have a crucial impact on policy making, especially in the Middle East. Well, that's a conflict between two doctrines, the Mafia doctrine and the Adam Smith doctrine. And in this case, the Mafia doctrine wins. And it's striking, if you look over the history, that there are such cases, and they're very interesting ones. And you find that the very same individuals will make different decisions depending on whether they're running a corporation or running the government. So the same individual could, if the same people who are making the decisions in the case of Iran, let's give it to China, if they were still running their energy corporations or Halliburton or whatever, they'd make the opposite decision. but they now they have an institutional role in state policy, which is different from the role of the CEO of the corporation. The CEO of the corporation has an institutional role. They got to maximize profit. They got to do that. It's a legal requirement, and if they don't do it, they're out, and somebody else comes in and will do it. So that's an institutional role. The role of the same individual, say in the State Department or the Pentagon, is to consider the long-term consequences of policy choices and of the policy choices that are made. That sometimes conflicts with the parochial interests of a particular sector of the economy. So what you get is a conflict, and in this case, the mafia principle wins. The same individuals who might be running oil companies are deciding that for the long-term goals of controlling the Middle East and making sure nobody else horns in, it's necessary to take positions which in fact harm the energy corporations. It's not the only case. Policy towards Cuba is the same. So in the case of Cuba, it's quite interesting to study. For real international relations theory, these are the things that people should study. In the case of Cuba, for 50 years, ever since Cuban independence, the U.S. has been attacking and punishing the people of Cuba. And we know exactly why. The documents are all out. You have to punish the people of Cuba, and it's Kennedy, Eisenhower, and so on. You have to punish the people of Cuba because Cuba isn't following orders. They are carrying out what the Kennedy and Johnson administrations call successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine. No Russians. Monroe Doctrine said we run the hemisphere. Cuba's carrying out successful defiance. We're back to the mafia principle. Can't let a small storekeeper do that. So we got to punish the people of Cuba until they overthrow their government. Meanwhile, the American population is opposed. For decades, the large majority of the population has been in favor of normalizing relations. The world is totally opposed. Just take a look at the UN General Assembly votes every year. It's the world versus the United States, Marshall Islands or something. That's not unusual. But what's striking in this case is that major sectors of American business are opposed. That includes the energy corporations, it includes pharmaceuticals, it includes agribusiness. They all want to normalize relations. Well, those are following the Adam Smith principle. You'd expect them to determine policy. But it's overridden by the mafia principle in that case too, and that's a small storekeeper. It's not like Iran. It's a big storekeeper. Well, okay, that's the way international affairs work. If you really want to study it seriously, those are the cases you should look at. And just if you want to understand U.S. Cold War policy, you should look at what happened in 1990. But those are exactly the topics that are off the agenda. You don't study them in graduate school. There's no academic literature about them. There's no commentary about them. They're just too revealing. So therefore, they've got to be hidden somewhere. But Iran's a very interesting case in that respect, for exactly the reason you mentioned.
And could you reflect?
Incidentally, with your last comment, it's not the first time in the case of Iran. So, for example, in 1953, when the U.S. and Britain overthrew the parliamentary regime and installed the Shah, the U.S. government wanted American oil companies to take 40% of the British concession. That was part of the long-term policy of kind of edging the British out of the Middle East and taking over and turning them into a junior partner. The oil companies didn't want to do it for short-term reasons. It turned out there was a kind of an oil glut at the time, and if they took over the Iranian concession, they would have to reduce liftings in Saudi Arabia, which is much more important for them. The oil's much cheaper, it's got a lot more oil and so on. They didn't want to harm relations. Their short-term parochial interests led them to prefer not taking the British concession. But they were compelled by the federal government, U.S. government, to take it. They were threatened with antitrust penalties and so on, so they followed orders. It's another striking case where the mafia principle, long-term concerns about the control of oil, overrode the specific parochial interests of the major architects of policy. Those are interesting cases.
And could you reflect on Britain's role in the mafia system, and are there any conflicting interests with US elites? And secondly, shortly, could Britain and the EU do anything to resolve or to encourage a solution of the Israel-Palestine conflict if they would act more independent from the US?
Britain's an interesting case. Britain, of course, had been the major global power prior to the Second World War, though it was already weaker than the United States economically. During the Second World War, there was kind of a mini-war going on between Britain and the United States over control over Middle East oil, mainly Saudi Arabia. It was understood by the late 30s that that's the real prize, the jewel in the crown. And Britain wanted to keep it, the United States wanted to take it away. So there was a battle going on. We have the documents on it, and of course the United States won. Britain was in dire straits at the time, couldn't do much. So the U.S. took over Saudi Arabia. At the end of the Second World War, the British understood that their role as the international hegemon was essentially over. And the Foreign Office recognized that they would have to be what they called junior partners of the United States. They had no illusions about what the U.S. was up to. They said the U.S. is taking over the world under a pretext of benevolence and so on and so forth, but they're just after power, and we have no choice except to be a junior partner. And we could become independent and join Europe, but they preferred to be a junior partner. And so it continues. Britain has chosen the role of junior partner. That's why it didn't join the Eurozone. It still thinks of itself as an independent actor in world affairs. Of course it's not. The U.S. treats them with total contempt, and the British just take it, no matter how often they're kicked in the face. Cases like Skyfall in the early 60s, for example. Actually, the most striking case is the 1962 missile crisis. During the missile crisis, U.S. leaders, the Kennedy guys, were making decisions which they understood could lead to the destruction of Europe and the destruction of England. They were pushing things to the point where there might be a Russian retaliation. The Russians could destroy England. They couldn't attack the United States. And they were making decisions with those high probability consequences. They weren't telling the British about it. In fact, Harold Millen, the Prime Minister, didn't know anything about what was going on. He was kind of desperate to find out, but the only thing he knew was what British intelligence could dig up. And right at that point, within the Kennedy administration, one of the senior advisors, it was probably Dean Acheson, defined what he called the special relationship between the U.S. and Britain. He said the special relationship means that Britain is our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner. Well, the British like to hear the fashionable word, but the truth is they're our lieutenant. In fact, that's roughly the difference between Bush and Obama. Bush just told them straight out, you're our lieutenant, get lost. They didn't like that. Europe didn't like that. Obama's kind of nicer rhetoric. He says, yes, you're our partner. When you get back home, you're a lieutenant, and you kick in the face. And Europe's much happier with that. Britain too. But that's actually, I think that was an accurate description. Europe has choices. Those choices have been a serious concern for U.S. policy since 1950. I mean, the U.S. understood, U.S. planners understood, and of course wasn't very profound, didn't say the early post-war period, that Europe was going to recover. There would be industrial recovery in Europe. And once they do, they're a power on the scale of the United States. Big economy, just like the U.S., a bigger population, educated population, a lot of advantages. They could become an independent force in world affairs. They could become what was called a third force. It's a big danger. You can't run the world if there's a big independent force. And a lot of efforts were made to prevent that. One of them is called NATO. Part of the goal of NATO was to ensure that Europe would remain a vassal under U.S. control. And again, what happened in 1990 is quite striking in this respect. I mean, if anybody believed the propaganda of the preceding 50 years, then as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, you'd expect NATO to be disbanded. I mean, the propaganda about NATO is, well, it was there to protect us from the Russian hordes. Okay, no more Russian hordes, so let's disband NATO. Is that what happened? NATO expanded in quite an interesting way. Gorbachev made an incredible concession. He agreed to let a united Germany, unified Germany, join NATO, hostile military alliance. If you think about it, that's pretty astonishing. I mean, Germany alone had virtually destroyed Russia a couple of times in the past century. And now Gorbachev was agreeing to let a unified Germany join a hostile military alliance led by the world's superpower. Why did he do it? Because there was a quid pro quo. He did it with an agreement with the Bush administration that NATO would not expand, the phrase was, would not expand 1 inch to the east. It would not include East Germany, and obviously nothing beyond. Well, Gorbachev was naive. That was a gentleman's agreement. The Bush administration was careful never to put it on paper. We have a detailed record of this by now, detailed scholarly record. It's quite interesting. Gorbachev made the stupid error of thinking he could make a gentleman's agreement with the United States. That's pretty stupid. And the United States had the slightest intention of living up to it, and of course didn't. So immediately NATO expanded to the east, included East Germany, then the 1990s under Clinton, right to the borders of Russia. Now NATO's expanded even further. Its official role now is to control the global energy system, to control the sea lanes and the pipelines. There was just a conference in Washington a couple of weeks ago led by former Secretary of State Albright, which outlined a global mission for NATO. Well, the idea is NATO should become a U.S.-run global intervention force. Now there's conflict over this. Like, Europeans aren't all that happy about spending the money and so on. The U.S. is attacking them for being too nonviolent. In fact, there was an interesting article in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago by Richard Hodge, who's head of the Council on Foreign Relations, and kind of an old high-level foreign policy official. The title was "Goodbye Europe. We don't need you anymore. You're not violent enough. You're not willing to pour enough money into serving as our global intervention force, so goodbye Europe." Well, he didn't really mean it. The U.S. means Europe, but it's a sign of tensions. And what happened with NATO is quite instructive. I mean, it's a dramatic illustration of the fact that all of the propaganda of the Cold War was just complete lies. So NATO doesn't disappear. When the Russian hordes disappear, it expands. And it expands in order to make sure that Europe doesn't carry out that dangerous option that you're referring to of becoming an independent force in world affairs, which it could. And NATO is supposed to constrain that. It's a military force run by the U.S. Okay, Europe has choices. You don't have to accept that path.
A couple of years ago, I sent yourself and Michael Albert an email about the idea of climate war, militarization, climate war.
Climate war?
Climate war. And the broad idea was there's often been a call by elites like Al Gore and other people like Prince Charles for us all to mobilize, a kind of national mobilization to fight climate change.
That's a very interesting case. Here's a very striking case of the lethal effects of markets. It's a dramatic illustration of the lethal effects of markets. I mean, markets have certain properties. We don't really have a market society. It's kind of like a semi-market society. So the corporate sector knows it can appeal to the state to come along and save it when it gets into trouble. So it's a state capitalist economy, but it partially has market principles. And those market principles function. So suppose you're the CEO of an energy corporation, or for that matter, suppose you're in the Chamber of Commerce, big business lobby. Well, you have certain interests. As part of your institutional role in a market system, you have to maximize short-term profit. You just have to do that. You don't have any choices. If you decide not to do it, you're out and someone else is in who does do it. So it's not a choice. That means you have to ignore what economists call externalities, the effect of a transaction on others. You have to ignore that. If you pay attention to it, you're out. First of all, it's illegal, but you're also out anyhow, because somebody else will do it. Well, that has consequences. One consequence, incidentally, is the repeated financial crises. They follow almost automatically from the necessity to ignore externalities. The externalities in the case of the financial system are called systemic risk. So like if Goldman Sachs makes a transaction, assuming they're well managed, they have to take into account their own welfare. What will happen to us if the loan goes bad? But they don't take into account and cannot take into account the risk that the whole system will collapse. Okay, that's virtual guarantee of financial crisis. That's why they keep repeating them over and over again, becoming worse and worse. It's not a big secret. You learn it the first term of Econ 101. So you have to ignore externalities. Okay, in the case of systemic risk, okay, it's not an overwhelming problem because the powerful state will step in and rescue you and end up being richer than before, as we've just seen. But let's take the climate change. The CEOs of corporations and the guys in the Chamber of Commerce and so on, they have to follow the policy of ignoring externalities. Well, the externality in this case happens to be the fate of the species. But nobody's going to step in and bail you out. Now, the guys who are making those decisions, and they're running huge propaganda campaigns to try to convince Americans that it's all a liberal hoax. And they're trying to beat back any legislation that might do anything about it, prevent Copenhagen and so on. Those same people know exactly the same beliefs you do about climate change. They know that it's a serious risk, that it's going to destroy everything they own. It's going to destroy the lives of their grandchildren, or maybe their great-grandchildren. As human beings, they know that. But when they move back to the office, the CEO office, they have to forget that. There they have to keep to the market principle of ignoring the externalities, in this case, the fate of the species. And that's what we're facing. That's why there isn't any legislation, and there isn't any campaign. And there won't be as long as we permit this element of market systems to function.
Do you think it's safe to allow financiers to try and internalize climate change and develop carbon markets, for instance? Is that a greater risk?
If you can figure out a way for the corporations to make money out of dealing with climate change, well, yeah, maybe something will happen. But anything you work out is just still ignoring the externalities. So, it's been argued. So, for example, Robin Panel had a couple articles in ZNet, I think, in which he said, look, cap and trade is a horrible proposal. It's the only thing that you can ever ram through a corporate-run system. So, go to say, okay, maybe. But as you can see, they don't want it.
Sure.
We're playing with big stakes at this point. It's much worse than financial crisis. Literally, it's fate of the species. And there are serious institutional reasons. Not bad people, not greedy bankers or anything like that. Just people fulfilling the necessary institutional role. That's pretty hard to do. It'll take a lot of work.
What would be the American reaction if Canada were to actually shut down the tar sands? What would be the American reaction if Canada were to actually shut down the tar sands? If Canada were to shut down the tar sands?
If Canada
would shut down the tar sands.
Oh, the tar sands? Well, if the United States wanted them, they'd just conquer Canada. They wouldn't have to go that far, because the countries are sufficiently integrated, so Canada would be what the U.S. says. Actually, as you probably know, the United States has tried to conquer Canada ever since 1775. It repeatedly tried to conquer Canada. It was beaten back by a superior British force. That's the only reason why Canada has kind of nominal independence. British deterrent. And finally, the U.S. kind of accepted the border. But since then, through other measures, Canada has become more and more subordinate to the United States. And the business community in Canada is in favor of that. Like, they don't oppose it. You know, they're quite happy to be subordinate, you know, with the U.S. power. And since they pretty much run Canadian politics, okay, they get more and more subordinate. Canada did threaten at one point during the Bush years. It did make a threat to shift its oil exports to China. What happened was there was a case in the under NAFTA. There was a case brought by Canada against the United States, and Canada won. And the United States told them to shut it. No, we don't care what the court decides. And Canada was kind of annoyed. So they said, well, okay, if you do that, we'll start sending oil to China, and the United States laughed. And that was the end of that story.
Following up on the question about the climate change being an externality and the compulsion.
It's the fate of the species that it's an externality.
Okay, well, okay, yeah, fate of the consequence of climate change. And I'm wondering, is there another market feature apart from the need to maximize profits that's also impinging on the environment, and that is our money system, the fractional reserve banking system, does that require growth? That aspect of the economy require growth in order to maintain the system and avoid collapse.
There's a lot of kind of internet gossip about the fractional reserve system, and that's somehow a big problem. Ron Paul and those guys feel about it. I don't really believe it. I mean, we can't eliminate the money system. Nobody wants to go back to barter. And the fractional reserve system just means you lend money beyond the liquidity that you have in your pocket, which is the only way to keep an economy functioning. I mean, for whether it's an individual household, most households are running on debt, and they should be. And governments are running on debt, and businesses are running on debt, and somebody's got to be providing the liquidity for it. Other than that, they'd be constrained. I mean, if you couldn't, say, borrow money to buy a car or send your kids to college or buy a house or something, life would be very constrained. So I don't think that's the problem. There's a lot of talk about it, but I think it's misplaced.
It seems to be getting more and more difficult to have any kind of resistance against Palestine or against Israel, and just as far as like when U.S. activists go over there, they're killed, like Rachel Corrie, and the other day a U.S. activist was blinded on one of the ships. So what kind of role can us in the U.S. play? What kind of resistance do you think is effective towards the situation?
What you describe is accurate, but I think that that's an illustration of the opposite, that it's easier to carry out resistance. Solidarity workers weren't being killed a couple of years ago because there weren't any. There was no solidarity movement. Okay, now there's a solidarity movement, so yeah, you get the Rachel Corrie cases. But that's an illustration of the fact that it's easier to protest. In fact, I know it from personal experience. Others who've been activists for a long time are familiar with it. When you go back a couple of years, I literally had to have police protection if I was giving a talk at MIT, my own university, let alone anywhere else. I remember cases not many years ago where the Cambridge police insisted on accompanying my wife and me back from a talk at MIT to our car because they'd picked up, they infiltrate all the organizations and they picked up death threats and so on. Well, that's long gone. By now, if you give a talk, huge audience, you can't get a hostile question. The mood has just changed. The change in the mood has not reached educated sectors, it's not reached the media, it's not reached the political class, but the options for action are far greater. There is an international solidarity movement. There's a lot of very good, courageous people participating in it. And one of the consequences, yeah, we get the racial cars. So yes, it's real, but I think it's an illustration of the fact that the options for protest are much greater.
Like, do you think protests are the best way to go? Like us organizing protests here?
Organized
Or what?
protest is now very much easier than it used to be. And that means other actions too. After all, there are other actions being taken beyond protest. Like, for example, a boycott of products from the occupied territories. It's a very realistic option. A lot of people are doing it. It's a very good thing to do. Actually, there's more that can be done. As you may know, Amnesty International, during the Gaza attack, Amnesty International came out with a report calling on the United States to terminate all arms shipments to Israel because they're illegal under international law. And they didn't add this, but if they could have added, it's illegal under U.S. law. Under U.S. law, you cannot provide arms to a country except for defensive purposes. Well, as I mentioned, these are not defensive purposes. So therefore, U.S. arms to Israel are in fact illegal under American law and also under international law. So the solidarity movements could pick that up. And they could say, okay, let's call for an arms embargo. Let's obey American law. I don't think you can reach the American population with a call for obeying American law. That would be pretty serious for Israel. It would also be serious for American business. Like, Lockheed Martin and the rest of them, one of the reasons they love Israel is because whenever the United States provides $3 billion of military aid to Israel, it goes into their pockets. They say that means they sell Israel advanced weaponry, and it has a second effect. When they sell Israel advanced weaponry, the rulers of the Gulf states say, we want some too. It's kind of like a teaser in a department store. They say, look, we want some of the goodies too, and then Lockheed Martin and the rest of them can send huge amounts of second-rate military equipment to Saudi Arabia, which they can't do anything with, and it's nowhere near what they sell to Israel, but it's a lot of money coming back to them. So that's great. Calling on an arms embargo against Israel and Egypt, for that matter, second largest recipient of American aid, makes a lot of sense. And I think those are realistic prospects. The sanctions movement, if it's done properly, I mean, it can be done badly, but if it's done properly, it can be significant. There are other options open now, and Israel's very much concerned about them, so is the U.S. That's one of the reasons for the paranoia effect, that they feel there's a movement attempting to delegitimize them. Well, it's not delegitimizing them, it's delegitimizing their criminal actions. Okay, that can be called out.
How resistant is the U.S. to a nuclear weapons-free zone?
That's a very good question, and it's right on the international agenda. The Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference that was held a couple of weeks ago, one of the main things that came out of it was an international call for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Now, if the U.S. had any interest in ending nuclear proliferation, if Obama believed the word he was saying, he would be calling for nuclear weapons-free zones all over the world. It's not a complete solution to proliferation, but it's a pretty significant one. Instead, the U.S. is doing the exact opposite. In this case, the administration was kind of caught because it couldn't come out openly and say, well, no, we don't want a nuclear weapons-free zone. That's too obvious. So what they did was they said, well, yes, we agree with the world. We want a nuclear weapons-free zone, but it has to wait until there's a comprehensive peace treaty. Okay, it means until the Messiah comes. And we can block a comprehensive peace treaty exactly the way we can do it for 35 years. So yes, we're all in favor of it. It's a wonderful idea. But it's got to wait until we get a comprehensive peace treaty, which we can continue to block just the way we've been blocking it. And the United States further stated that it's not going to accept anything that either restricts Israeli nuclear activities or that calls upon major powers, meaning the United States, to reveal what they know about Israeli nuclear facilities. So we're saying, well, we can't accept any treaty that forces us to tell what we know. The Security Council, the Asian Security Group, the CICA, that just met a couple of days ago, they reiterated that again. In fact, the world has been strongly calling for a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. And it's never reported, but it's worth bearing in mind that the U.S. and Britain have a unique commitment to that. Unique commitment for reasons that can't be reported, but are very straight. When the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq, they tried to construct a kind of a thin legal cover for it. And the way they did it was by appealing to a Security Council resolution from 1991, Resolution 687, if you want to look it up. With that resolution in 1991 called upon Saddam Hussein to eliminate his weapons of mass destruction programs. That was the pretext for the invasion, as you recall. Okay, we don't have to worry about the nature of the pretext. That was pretty well exploded. But that resolution is interesting. Go to Article 14 of that resolution and read it. It commits the signers to establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Okay, that means the U.S. and Britain, over all other countries, are formally committed to this. Okay? Now, they can get away with it because the media and the educated classes keep quiet. Now, that doesn't mean we have to keep quiet. We can say, yeah, you guys are really committed to that. And therefore your efforts to evade it are, can't be tolerated. And quite apart from the fact that if it was instituted, it would mitigate and perhaps eliminate any possible threat that Iran might pose. Not much of a threat, as I mentioned at the beginning, whatever it is, so that would eliminate that. So, it's a very positive step. The U.S. is blocking it. But remember that the Obama administration is blocking every other nuclear weapons-free zone at the same time. Also, it doesn't get reported. That's quite important. Like Africa, it just, after a lot of years of negotiation, finally reached agreement on a nuclear weapons-free zone. There's only one hang-up. The U.S. won't allow it. Africa includes an island in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia. It was a British territory, and at U.S. orders, the British expelled the population and turned it into an American military base, one of the main military bases. It's functioning. That's the military base that the U.S. uses to bomb the Middle East and Central Asia and so on, as a major base. And the U.S. stores nuclear weapons there. And that's going up under the Obama administration. In fact, in December, the Navy announced that it's sending a submarine tender to Diego Garcia to accommodate the nuclear submarines with nuclear-tipped missiles in Diego Garcia. Obama announced that he's sending to Diego Garcia what are called bunker busters, the most lethal weapon in the arsenal, short of nuclear weapons, that are designed for attacking Iran. This is being built up there. So the U.S. will not allow the African nuclear weapons-free zone to proceed because it wants to use it for nuclear weapons. Same thing's happening in the South Pacific. The South Pacific countries also reached an agreement on a nuclear weapons-free zone. Well, at first that was blocked by France because France wanted to use its French island possessions for testing nuclear weapons. Okay, that's done. They carried out the tests and that's over. Now the U.S. is blocking them because the U.S. island possessions are used for storing nuclear weapons for the passage of nuclear submarines. So that nuclear weapons-free zone is gone. But the most important one is the Middle East. And that's really critical and it's a major issue. There is the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty conference, the review conference a couple of weeks ago, ended up, the U.S. kind of blocked the decision there, but it did end up with a call for a conference, I think in 2012, to consider this issue, to focus on this issue. And the U.S. is going to be in a kind of a bind then, because that's going to be the world, calling for a nuclear weapons-free zone, and the U.S. having to try to figure out a way to evade it. A nuclear weapons-free zone would not only include Israel, U.S. allies, it would include U.S. forces. Meaning any U.S. forces deployed couldn't use nuclear weapons. And Obama's new strategic posture if you read it carefully, says, okay, we won't use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapons states, with an exception. Iran or anybody else is in the way. There we can use nuclear weapons even against the state without nuclear weapons. So yeah, they're probably deployed in the region. So these are major issues. I mean, if anybody really cared about nuclear proliferation, they'd be focusing on this.
I have a question about BDS, the BDS strategy. Aside from the military and security and telecommunications sectors, which are heavily subsidized by the Defense Department, what other sectors of the U.S. economy are heavily invested in Israel and the occupied territory?
The Caterpillar. Caterpillar is, somebody mentioned Rachel Corrie before. Rachel Corrie was killed by Caterpillar, one of these huge Caterpillar like bulldozers or something. I mean, the Caterpillar is supplying the weapons for turning the occupied territories into deserts. That's in violation of international law. And boycotting Caterpillar makes a lot of sense. In fact, boycotting any American company that's involved in the occupied territories is not only proper, but even legal. Just the same is true of boycotting products that come from the West Bank.
I have a second part to that. Do you also support cultural and academic boycotts and divestments?
Well, so like boycotting dance groups and things like that.
Or academic universities?
Academic institutions. I don't myself.
Okay.
Frankly, even in the case of South Africa, I didn't agree with it. In the case of Israel, I don't agree with it, first of all, in principle, but also just tactically. I mean, if you want to think, if you want to be serious about any action, you know, whether whatever it may be, you first have to ask yourself, am I carrying this out because I want to feel good, or am I carrying it out because I care about the victims? And that leads to different decisions. So maybe the weathermen felt that they felt good breaking windows. That wasn't helping the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese didn't like it. In fact, what the Vietnamese wanted was peaceful demonstrations. But it sort of felt good to break windows when doing something. And the same is true of this. Forgetting all questions of principle, if you decide to boycott Tel Aviv University, why not boycott Harvard? And then at MIT, you know, is guilty of far worse crimes. And the hypocrisy is so blatant that it just turns into putting a weapon in the hands of the most hardline elements. They can say, look, you guys are total hypocrites. Mm-hmm. Why are you attacking Israel? Why not yourselves? Or, for example, there's talk now about there's all kinds of proposals like that. You just have to look at every one of them and see exactly what its consequences are. I mean, if you're serious about activism, you think seriously about tactics. Tactics are important. And you can't just follow them because it makes us feel good. You have to follow them because it's going to help the victims, not harm them. And in some cases like these, I think it harms them. And I think you clear examples of that. I'll give you one example right in Cambridge. A couple of years ago, there was a Harvard-MIT petition. It was for a good purpose. It was protesting the massacres in Jenin. But it was formulated in a way which allowed the hardline elements to emphasize the hypocrisy of it, which was there for these reasons. So what happened is that Cambridge was then consumed for a couple of months by the crucially important issue of anti-Semitism at Harvard. Larry Summers, the president, made a big speech about anti-Semitism at Harvard. That's one I talked about for a couple of months. Jenin was forgotten. Okay, that's not a help for the Palestinians. You have to think about what you're doing and what the consequences are. That's quite apart from questions of principle, just on narrow tactical grounds. I think the BDS movement often doesn't take that seriously enough.
The Australian academic Clive Hamilton has recently written the book Requiem for a Species, which I think I saw you actually commended. A couple of times tonight, or today, you've touched on
environmental catastrophe, biblical end times, these sorts of themes. I mean, for a lot of people, I think we may be freezing up, or we're looking for a prophet, or people are, wondering what the hell to do. Is there actually a technical problem that we need to solve, or is it a social problem?
It's both. I mean, the climate change, to deal with climate change, the details you can argue about, but there's hardly any serious doubt that anthropogenic climate change is taking place, and it could have a very serious effect. That leads to social problems and technical problems. And the technical problems, for example, probably the most far-reaching one is to find ways to use solar energy, the one ultimate renewable endless resource for energy on Earth. And there are ideas about it. I mean, I'm not technically competent to judge them, but I know guys in the engineering department at MIT who are serious scientists who think it's feasible to, and they have long articles about this, to put dishes in receptors in space outside the Earth's atmosphere, in orbit, so they get solar energy without any disruption, and to use microwaves and techniques to get it to Earth and then distribute it. It's possible, and it's a renewable source of energy. Right, maybe that's the right answer, maybe something else is, but whatever it is, it's sophisticated technology. And that's going to have to be that, or something like it's going to have to be part of the solution. On the other hand, there are social problems. I mean, in the United States, particularly, it's worth remembering that there have been massive social engineering projects in the United States since the Second World War to drive the economy towards inefficient use of fossil fuels. It's actually, it's conspiracies. In fact, some of them went to court and were fined for conspiracy. The U.S. used to have pretty efficient electric rail systems. You used to be able to get around New England with electric rail. Los Angeles, this is now a monstrosity, had a very efficient electric rail system. Well, all of these things were destroyed by state corporate programs, very conscious programs, to try to drive the economy towards massive wasteful use of fossil fuels. Some of them actually went to court. Corporations were fined for conspiracy, Captain Notice. The other massive social engineering projects drove the population out of the cities into the suburbs. All kind of inducements to go to the suburbs, destroy the cities. Well, I don't object to living in the suburbs. In fact, I do. I kind of like it. But it's from the point of view of an economy, it's just crazy. I mean, you can't live in the suburbs where I live, not far from Boston, without having 2 cars and a family. Like the nearest public transportation is a couple miles away, and it rarely comes. There's also racist issues. So, for example, where I live, actually western suburbs of Boston, there was a proposal back in the 70s to extend the subway system out to the western suburbs, which interestingly would have saved people where I live a couple hours of commuting time every day. But people, wealthy, it's a progressive suburb, everybody votes for the government, that sort of thing. But people living there prefer to spend 2 hours fighting Boston traffic rather than facing the threat that some black kid from Dorchester might walk around Lexington Center. So no subway, so therefore we fight traffic all the time. Well, those are major social problems. They're all over the country. And those things have to be dealt with somehow. You cannot have a society geared to maximal waste of fossil fuels and expect it to survive. So there's both significant social problems and straight technological problems, which have to be dealt with somehow.
Going back, I know this is a little while ago, but going back to this gentleman's question right here about our currency system, it seems that our economy and our currency is it has certain properties that manifest certain behaviors, and it seems that our currency is designed in such a way that with interest and with it being lent in through debt, that you can accrue wealth by virtue of just having wealth. And do you think that there's any value as a sort of strategy for dealing with that? Do you think there's any value in working class people and in citizens using alternative, local, or sort of differently valued currencies to directly exchange and create value amongst themselves, as opposed to capitulating to an economy that's not designed to serve their needs in the first place, which some people are doing around the nation with various degrees of success and failure?
I think it's almost impossible. I mean, we live in a complex society, actually a global society, and how you get along without a currency system of roughly the kind we have, I don't understand. Yes, you could have a local currency system for Boston, but suppose you take a trip to New York, okay, we would do. Plus the fact that you could never accumulate the reserves that would allow you to borrow enough money to finance a car, let's say. And it's just not going to work. These are not, I don't think that, there is a lot of talk about the currency system. I think it's misguided. I mean, there's a lot of things wrong with it, I'm sure. Like the Fed, for example, is owned by banks. The Fed does not meet its legal requirements. The Fed is, by law, is supposed to be geared towards full employment. They don't do that. They're geared towards the needs of the banks, who pretty much own them, not too much inflation. So yes, there are things wrong with the currency system, but replacing it by kind of local currencies of the kind that the country had back in the 19th century, I can't see how it could work. I don't think that's the real problem.
Since a few years back, Venezuela has made efforts to export the Bolivarian Revolution, to export the Bolivarian Revolution to, I think it was about 9 different countries, including Cuba, Bolivia, and other Caribbean, South American countries. And they proposed even to implement a new currency, the sucre, which, whether it works or not is neither here nor there. But I'm wondering whether that alliance could, in your opinion, do you think it could culminate into, a significant enough power, eventually to the degree of moving beyond an oil-based economy?
I don't think so. Maybe it's a good idea in some abstract sense, but in the real world, I can't imagine how it would work. I mean, for example, it doesn't include the major economy in South America, the dynamo of South America, Brazil. It includes, it's not really exporting any kind of revolution. It's calling for other institutions that would be independent from the U.S.-dominated ones. But it can't even begin to approach the scale that would make a difference as far as I can see. I mean, there are good things, like Petrocaribe, so, giving low-cost oil to, say, Haiti, places like that. Yeah, that makes sense. The border exchange with Cuba makes sense. Cuba and Venezuela are each pursuing their comparative advantage. Actually, the economists so like it. Cuba's providing trained personnel, doctors, teachers, and so on. That's their comparative advantage. Venezuela's providing oil. Their comparative advantage. People who study economics ought to cheer. But it's nothing, that's just conventional economics. There's no revolution associated with it. And those countries are just not in a position to create an alternative. I mean, there are, it's good that Latin America is moving towards independent institutions, like UNASUR, Mercosur, the Organization of Latin American States that was just formed without the U.S. But those moves are all moves in the right direction, I think. But unless they include the major Latin American countries, they're not going to get off the ground. At least Brazil.
Earlier, we were talking about the Adam Smith kind of policy and the
mafia policy principle. And I'm just wondering, it seems like the mafia principle would always win. I mean, any economic policy is going to fall in line with the mafia policy if it's going to work. Whether it's short term or long term, like maybe it falls in line in the long term. It doesn't look like it does in the short term. But are there any examples?
Sometimes it doesn't.
So
In fact, I mentioned a couple of cases where it conflicts with the Adam Smith principle.
Right.
The obvious principle that the people who own the country pretty much run the policies.
Right.
Okay, sometimes it conflicts.
Well, I'm just saying, so it conflicts, but it seems like the mafia principle would always win out.
Not
Are there any
necessarily.
examples where
There are
that's not the
cases
case?
where pursuing the narrow parochial interests of major sectors of the economy wins out over efforts to run the world.
But that would be short term.
Short term.
Like in the long term, the mafia principle is always going to win out because if you lose control.
I don't think you can really say much. These things depend on marginal factors of decision making, which are pretty hard to predict. Even the individuals involved can't predict them. Like, for example, should you continue the policy of punishing Cubans? I don't know if there have been moments in recent American history where, especially under the Carter administration, where moves were made towards improving relations, and Reagan came in, they backed off. There are a lot of factors, some of them personally influence these. I doubt that you can find principles that are operative, and they usually coincide, but there are cases where they conflict, which are constructive. And in real international relations theory, that's what people study. But I just don't believe you're going to find deep principles determining any of this. Too much complexity.
There's a lot of talk everywhere except in the U.S. press about the apartheid regime in the occupied territories. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the racist laws inside Israel proper and what impact they might have on a potential two-state solution given the demographic issue.
I don't think the demographic issue is ever going to arise. I think that's an illusion of Palestinians and supporters of Palestine. Israel's policies, and with the U.S. backing them, like the convergence programs, they don't leave any demographic problem. Israel's taking over areas that have practically no Arabs. That the Arabs can be off somewhere in Iraq. Okay? So there won't be a demographic problem. The Palestinians, the people who talk about one state, are just pursuing illusions. They're following pretty reasonable policies which are going to prevent any demographic problem. In fact, it might be even worse than that. There is a proposal, it was proposed by Victor Lieberman, a kind of ultra-right-wing nationalist, he's now foreign minister, to take the areas in Israel of heavy Arab population density, Wadi Ara, the region, which includes the Al-Fahd, the biggest Arab city, and just forcibly remove it from Israel and force it into the West Bank. Well, when that was proposed, it was called neo-Nazi. Of course, the people there strongly oppose it. They don't want to, they've been bold and studied, they don't want to move from a rich first world country into a non-existent, rural territory that may not be able to survive, but who cares about them? So it was, yes, properly called a neo-Nazi program. By now it's a centrist program. It's been taken over by Kadima, the centrist party, Tzipi Livni, who's the hope of the doves, she's advocated it. New York Times advocates it. The New York Times described it as a very positive proposal which ought to satisfy the doves on the left because it's moving towards two-state settlement. And in fact, if you look back at the history of it, it goes back to a highly respected U.S. Scholar who's considered a liberal humanist, one of the spokesmen for democratic socialism, Michael Walzer. He's a professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies, the democratic socialist theoretician. He proposed back in the early 70s that he put it rather politely. He said creating a nation is a difficult process, and sometimes those who are marginal to the nation, meaning Palestinians, have to be helped to move, just out of humanity. So since the Palestinians are marginal to the nation and their country, they have to be helped to move. Okay, that's the neo-Nazi policy of Victor Lieberman, goes back to highly respected American democratic socialists. But that might be done, and that would reduce the demographic problem even further. So I don't think there's going to be a demographic problem. There's another demographic problem inside Israel, and that's the high birth rate of the religious sector. It has a big effect on the country. A lot of things you can say about that. But what about the racist laws inside Israel? Well, that's a very interesting topic. The most extreme of them was the land laws. There have been land laws inside Israel which should, in various devious ways, place about 90% of the country in the hands of an organization which is, by law, by its contract with the State of Israel, is required to act solely in the interests of, I'm quoting, people of Jewish race, religion, and origin. That's the Jewish National Fund. That's a tax-free institution in the United States, which means that every American is funding an institution committed to act in the interests of people of Jewish race, religion, and origin, which through various arrangements controlled 90% of the country. That's pretty serious. Nobody can talk about that, but it's utterly outrageous. I've written about it if you're interested. A couple other people have. Well, actually, there is a civil libertarian movement in Israel, and finally, in the year 2000, it's it's called ACRI, A-C-R-A-I, I forget what it stands for, Association for the Civil Rights in Israel, or something like that. They managed to get the High Court to consider this, and the High Court concluded that it's illegal, untenable. You can't have a law that blocks 92% of the land from Arabs and non-Jewish citizens. So they struck it down. It was in a particular case, one town, Hatzir, where a middle-class Arab family was trying to move in, and the town rejected their application on grounds of land laws. So the court struck that down. Well, about 6 years later, they were finally allowed to move in. As far as I know, that's the only case where the law has been applied. There are other cases since then where various devious means were devised to keep them out, but not compatible with the nature of the community and so on. People in America are perfectly familiar with this. This is our whole history. I've been through it. I remember when my wife and I couldn't pay the rents in Cambridge anymore, trying to move into the suburbs. And we looked around. There was one suburb which we kind of liked, so we asked the real estate agent, is there anything for sale there? And he looked at us and said, you wouldn't be happy here, which means they don't allow Jews in. There are various ways to do this kind of thing that's entirely familiar in the United States. And yeah, that's going on in Israel. Okay, these are problems, but these are problems for them to deal with. We don't have anything to say about them. We have such a horrible history. We have no right to say anything. But it's a real problem, and there are other laws like that. But those are kind of internal problems for Israel, not worse than other countries. Europe has horrible laws. It's not a matter for international boycotts, or else we'll boycott everyone in the world, including ourselves. But the question of apartheid arises in the occupied territories, and I don't think it's the right term, because what's going on there is much worse than apartheid. So it's a gift to Israel to call it apartheid for the reasons I mentioned. Bantustans is not the right word. They don't want Bantustans. They want the people out.
What term would you use?
It's plain racism. Imperialism. It's plain imperialism. It's settler colonialism. Let's get rid of the indigenous population. It's our history. We're the prime settler colonial society. Australia's another one. They also exterminated the indigenous population. Most imperialism leaves the indigenous population there. and tries to rule over them and so on. But settler colonialism, which is the worst kind, it exterminates them. Well, Israel can't exterminate them. You can't do that in the 20th century. You get away with it. So just like Diane said, make the situation so hot and they'll leave.
I went to see Mustafa Barghouti talk last month. I went to see Mustafa Barghouti talk last month, and he gave his position on why non-violent resistance is the way to go. Do you think it is working?
Actually, when I was blocked from going to Palestine, it was at his invitation. He was the person who issued the invitation for Herzliya University. And I think he's right. I think he's been right all along. They should have, the Palestinians made a serious error, in my opinion, and I'm not the only one. Dr. Lockwood tried to talk him into it, others, by accepting the arena of military conflict, which is just from a tactic, forgetting any ethical principle. It makes absolutely no sense to enter into a confrontation where the enemy has all the power. Now, for Israel, military confrontation is great. They're going to smash anything. The strength of the Palestinians would have been a nonviolent resistance, and there's some of it. And it was limited enough so that Israel could crush it. And it got, nonviolent resistance can't work unless it has some support somewhere, either in the oppressive society or the outside world. So what was done was pretty much crushed. But if it got to enough scale, it could succeed. And I don't think anything else can. Certainly not violence. I mean, that's Israel's story.
Yeah, Toronto is going to be hosting the G20 at the end of this month. Also the G8 the week before, and I understand that this is going to be the last time the G8 meets. And so I'm wondering, one, what you think of that. Actually, three parts to this. So that's the first question. The second question is, to the extent that the G20 was created to undermine social movements' opposition, how effective has that been? And what do you think the challenges are there? And three, there's, I think, in movements been a lot of debate about the value of, anti-summit convergences. There's been, within movements over the past decade, since like the height of anti-globalization stuff on this continent, debates about the value of convergence opposition, so like focusing on summits and these meetings as opportunities to build social movements. So I'm wondering also what you think about that.
Well, the shift from G8 to G20, there's actually a prior shift from G1 to G3, and then G3 to G8, and now G8 to G20. And it's a reflection of the increasing diversity of world power. I mean, you just can't exclude any longer the countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa. They're just too important. So, and they're forming their own organizations, which are active. They don't compare with the U.S., but they're doing things. Like this Asian grouping that I mentioned, that's independent of the United States. The United States is not part of it. And they meet. I mean, they're kind of not permitted into the Western discourse, but they're there. A very important one is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's China-based. It includes Russia, India. India's an observer. It includes Central Asian states. And it includes Pakistan as an observer, Iran as an observer. It blocked the United States. The United States was rejected. It's already passed resolutions opposing any U.S. military bases in Central Asia. Not trivial. And it's based on China and Russia, little countries, and plenty of resources and so on. And they're doing it kind of quietly, but it's a growing power system which could be kind of like NATO, but just based in Shanghai, China, and Russia, probably India. Well, okay, the world is just getting more diverse, so it's going up to G20, and it will probably have to go beyond. But what about protesting it? Well, I don't see any particular point for testing G20, but I think one can use the opportunity to educate about what's called globalization. Globalization is an ideological notion. It's not a descriptive one. I mean, the term globalization just means international integration. The strongest proponents of globalization are the people who lead the World Social Forum. I mean, those are people from all over the world, every walk of life, peasants, workers, all sorts of people who are interested in international integration. They're called anti-globalization. The reason is that the terminology is appropriated by the powerful, of course. And so for them, globalization means investor rights agreements. That's globalization. So NAFTA, for example, is globalization because it works for investor rights. But we don't have to accept that. We should say, yeah, we're the ones who favor globalization, or we think international integration is a great thing, which would be nice to speak. And I think the G20's the demonstrations can press that message. It means attacking the propaganda system right at its core.